Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you are watching on YouTube, you'll see a little link down below. If you click on that, you'll end up in Zoom. If you click on the link that's there, you'll end up in Mokana, and that's where you become a producer. You actually run the show. This show is driven by your questions and our attempt at answers to whatever you're asking. So so ask those questions in Mokana and vote those questions up. It's important because we spend more time on the top hour than the bottom hour of the hour. So so there's a lot of time for questions today. We have a 2-hour session of Q&A. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about audio plugins and the things that we like to use in our audio chain. And then Wednesday we have another Q&A session. Thursday we're going to talk about Keynote. I promised to do this a couple weeks ago and just didn't get to it. So we're going to talk about really producing high quality both presentations and video inside of Apple's Keynote. And then Friday we have Monogram. They make hardware like this. Hold on. Whoops. Little modular pieces that click together and can control your devices if you hold it right. Anyway, so that they work better on the desk than they do hanging up. But we're gonna have them come on and talk about how to. They've just released support for Final Cut Pro, and they of course support Premiere and lots of other tools. And so we're going to talk about how that works. And then of course education on Saturday. Now, if you think you can be part of these conversations, if you want to be part of the panel. You can get here early. You need to be here by 6:40 a.m. Pacific Standard Time to be part of the panel, so we can be part of our mic checks. And then, but you can come in as early as 6. And especially if you want to test your kit and see how things are going, make sure that, as you can see from this panel here, we take our setups pretty seriously. So if you want to come in a little early and not just try to jump right into it, you can come in early and hang out with us. All right, let's jump into the questions. I think Courtney is reading the questions today.
Oh, good morning. All right, first question up is from Rupert McCrae in Dallas, Texas. He says, any top tips for customizing Zoom waiting rooms with images and text?
Zoom waiting rooms with images and text. Is that even possible? Kind of. Yeah, go ahead, Rupert.
So according to if you go into the Zoom admin portal and go through there are some options to do it. I haven't tried them yet, but before I did, I was just wanting to see.
Yeah, Richard, you said, have you done a bit of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. There's not a huge amount that you can put into it, so it really is mostly a logo. At least I haven't done it in a couple of months, but the last time we did it, what we mainly put in was, welcome to this event from this such and such festival, and here's a couple of admin details. If you can't get in, here's how you can get a contact. Little kind of really just key little nuts, or if you have people coming in that you want to look a certain way, you can put in, we'll let you in a certain time, or we turn on your camera or mute yourself, things like that. It's really simple instructions.
Go ahead, David.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's global. So if you have multiple brands or multiple business units, any branding is going to be for the whole thing, and you got to change it per event.
That's important. Yeah, you do have to be careful with Zoom when you're in wherever the admin is. If it's not in the meeting area itself, you're affecting everything. So definitely something to keep in mind. Next question.
Okay, from Douglas Carmichael. With Zoom releasing NDI for Zoom rooms, does that make ZoomISO or ZoomISO a minor player?
No, I think that you have a lot more control with ZoomISO. Yeah, it only makes it better. Go ahead, George.
So absolutely not. Just my workflow is going to be here. I went the route of getting the 4K Decklink mini monitors. I'm putting 4 of them into a box, 2 separate boxes. So the HDMIs I'm going to use for my ATEM mini ISO, and then I could still take the SDI outs into my VMix
Which card
machine.
are you using?
So the Decklink mini monitors, because they have the HDMI out and the SDI out, because I wanted to get direct outs into the ATEM mini versus using converters. And it is showing up in ZoomISO, so it's working.
Wait, so and how are you, but what are you using to get out of the computer? I'm sorry. You're using a Decklink card?
Yes, I have an M1. I bought one of the Sonic 3-bang chassis. So I have 3 cards inside of it. And they're, like I said, the SDI and HDMI out.
How many at 1080p have you gotten out of that one box?
3 so far. Well, there's only 3 cards, so 3 outs.
Right, yeah. So what I'm not certain, but I think that the way that the SDI output works is that you'll be limited, and I think you'll be limited to 4 per computer. So I bought 5 Sonnets and I'm getting 5 Duos. to go into those. And then those are going to 5 Mac Minis. And then I'll pull 4 sources out of each one using ZoomISO. That way, that'll give me up to 20 outputs, that are coming out of Zoom,
Right.
from the SDI. So yeah, go ahead, Rupert.
So from my understanding, I mean, like ZoomISO is built up for a production workflow, and that's their specialty. NDI for Zoom Rooms, from my understanding, again, has been born out of more of a corporate environment for how corporations can distribute NDI, and it's kind of layered on above that. But I believe that's the angle they originally came at it from.
Yeah, go ahead, Talak.
Just a couple of things. If you buy ZoomISO, you've got it, and it's a one-time purchase, and you don't have to pay a monthly $50 fee for your room. And the other thing is that Zoom OSC is bundled within ZoomISO, and so you're pulling a couple of workflows together in a way that can be very, very powerful.
And what we're working on is a mixture of ZoomISO that's going to pull SDI feeds out, and then Zoom OSC to actually talk to the switcher and make decisions about what goes into the multi-sources, what goes into the multi-views. We're actually using the constellation as a router. So there's a lot of really interesting hybrids between those two tools that I think are going to be really important. So I'm excited that the NDI has been supported now. I'm more excited that the SDI is supported. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting things we're going to be able to do with it. Next question.
Jonas Dottel from Ruttlingen, Germany says, John Barker is launching H2R gear today in a live stream. Who on the panel has already tested it, and what did you think of it?
I think we've had, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I tried it. I laid out I recreated the diagram that using the H2R gear that I already have that I did in OmniGraffle. Whole lot easier to use than OmniGraffle.
Is it? That's good for me to know. Yeah.
but if you're, I don't know about, I'm guessing, Alex, you're like me. You've used OmniGraffle so much that it's kind of second nature to draw things.
Right.
I mean, I did it for machine room design. So this is doing my home office is a piece of cake.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to do, I haven't had time over the last week, but my plan is to do my office routing inside of H2R gear to just kick the tires, but I was going to do it last week and won't get to do it until this week. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, it helps me being kind of new to this world, and getting my head wrapped around routing. Diagramming is a sanity keeper, and it worked for me. Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, as we get ready to go back to the office, our boss asked us to put together a wish list of kit. So I used H2R graphics to kind of give her something definitive. Here's what I would like at my desk. Thank you very much.
Constellation, 8 hyperdecks, just the bare minimum. All right. Next question.
Okay, from Rupert McCrae in Dallas, Texas. When will 1 gigabit Ethernet or even 2 gigabit no longer be enough for the home?
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
So 1 and 2 gigabit Ethernet for the home is maybe a bit excessive, unless if you've got multiple people in the home, then that helps. So if everyone's streaming a different 4K TV show. But if you're trying to run like bringing everything in, let's say you're bringing like streams into the house and you're trying to pump them out like you're doing a TV show, then that's not necessarily for the home. And you'd need to up speed as well for that as well. So some don't have symmetrical, of course, with their speeds. But it's more to do with how many people are in your home and how many 4K TV shows are they watching simultaneously. That's where that helps.
Go ahead, Rupert.
I was just going to clarify that I was talking about internet connections like Carl talked about, not necessarily just internal Ethernet.
Yeah. I think that the interesting thing is that we're limited by how we use our internet is limited by the ISPs. So it is, where is the average user living, because that's what people are building content for, is where the average viewer can watch the content. And so I think that if the average user had 1 gig down, we'd see a different kind of television. But and if they had unlimited connections, which I think we're moving towards. I think that the competition, I used to be a big downer about 5G because I think it's kind of a snake oil, but I'm really excited that it's coming out because it's pressing the cable companies to give us better bandwidth, and unlimited connections and everything else. And so I think that that's exciting. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So the average family, 8 connections for their household, and about 120 gig per month. When we start adding in IoT stuff, and especially when video security cameras go past that 1080p threshold and start doing 4K, and then they end up making,
and that's on the up
8 camera spread. Yeah, and that's on the up. Then up and down if you're trying to access it through your panels on extra devices. We get up to 12 devices. I would say that would happen in about 2 to 3 years. That they'll start saying that we're at the 250 gig tier.
And the up,
but I bet you about 1 gig will be for a while.
We're already pretty painfully limited in the up version. The down of 1 gig, I think could last for a while. But I think that an 8K 120 frame per second video at a reasonable bandwidth is about 400 to 500 megs a second. Just to kind of put it in perspective, at maybe as little as 250 to 300 if you start pressing down on it hard. But that's the natural state of where we're going. And so we're limited by we're going to be limited in that delivery by how fast the ISPs make that available. But you're going to see a big push for 8K TVs, and there's not going to be anything on them, when it starts. But the Olympics are going to push that. The Super Bowl, again, will push it. It always pushes whatever the new thing is. And now, HDR and 8K are coming. You can see them you can always tell what's going on because the biggest TV inside of Best Buy tells you where they're trying to get to. and the biggest TVs right now are the 80-inch 8K TVs. And so I think that, and when we look at the support for high frame rate that Apple is kind of pressing down on, we should see a lot coming in that direction. Go ahead, Ken.
Do you think that new compression codecs would come before the need for that? Because I remember the time when getting internet, thinking over the telephone line, over that piece of copper, right, and the speed of that, and then broadband came about just through compression.
Well, I would say that the compression will get you to 250 to 300 megs a second with H.265. H.264 doesn't really exist in that area, but at H.265 you're 250 to 300 megs a second. H.264, I'm talking high quality image, maybe not what they'll send out at first, but if you really want to see HDR, high frame rate, all of those things start to multiply. So it's just a matter, like if you think about Disney is sending you, I believe it's 35 megs a second, 38 megs a second is what Disney's doing at 24p. So take that and go multiply it to 120, that's 5x. So now you're at almost 200 megs there. Then you go to, and that's 4K. But then you quadruple that. So, so that would be 800, if you did 800 megs a second to do that solution at that res. Now that's, so to get to, you could push that down a bit, but I'm still being conservative. And I still think that we are going to see high frame rate. It might take us 4 to 5 years to get high frame rate, as a general solution, but you're going to start seeing high frame rate. I think that we'll see a lot of high frame rate starting up this fall and then really building up next fall, and potentially 8K really becoming a thing, probably 2022, 2023. It is a different experience. Like I'll keep on saying this because I just know that not many people have seen it, but I can tell you as someone who's seen HDR 120 frame per second, 8K a fair bit. It's not like film. It's not like TV. It's like something else that you've never seen before. It's just like a window that you're looking out of, and it's an entirely different visual experience, and it has a whole bunch of problems. That if it fills your frame, your brain starts to not know what's going on. like there's a bunch of, when it edits, jib moves, all those things start to become problematic. So it's a very different experience, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And more people will be doing stuff. I had a Quest. I just bought a Quest. The Oculus Quest 2, I guess. And I was at something that kind of looked like vacation for everybody else last week in North Carolina, and all the kids basically ran it until it ran out of battery every single time. So we also have that coming as well, that eventually will be 6 to 8K per eye. So that'll be 2 8K streams that are coming for delivery. Go ahead, Courtney.
But won't they require a complete infrastructure change for it to be accepted, widely?
Oh yeah,
because nothing can handle. I know broadcast can't handle that kind of.
Broadcast is this is the end of broadcast.
Yeah,
like they'll never be able to do this. Like this is not
obviously.
Yeah, they're
at what point does your optical fiber start to melt because the bandwidth gets?
There's all kinds of backhaul problems, with it and the expense of it and the delivery of it. And there's a whole bunch of things that have to be fixed. But again, we'll see it probably first with Apple because it's Apple's business model to force the price point up of everything. Like it's their business model to make everything better at the cost of having to do it. So everyone trying to shave pennies, has a lesser experience, and so we'll probably see it in the Apple ecosystem first, and Apple will probably be willing to put it out on Apple TVs and everything else. But other people will think about it for a little while before, because a lot of the business models you'll probably have to pay extra, for instance, to get, like if you want the Disney 8K, you'll probably pay 2 or 3 times as much because it's not like they can't afford to send it to you, at the rate that they're giving it to you. So you're right that there's all kinds of problems. Broadcast is got problems because it doesn't have the money to upgrade again. Because it's in a shrinking market, not an expanding market. And it's, so it doesn't have the money to upgrade again. And 1080i is still something that gets bounced, still being delivered, and so it's going to be hard to keep up with where all this stuff is going. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yes, the problem is that most of the suppliers that would be supplying that kind of bandwidth aren't providing the last mile connection to the home. So
I know you're absolutely right. This is why it's limited to the ISP. Yep, no, absolutely. Go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to comment to something Courtney said earlier is to when was the fiber melt. The reality is all they have to do is change the light sources at the 2 endpoints, and because they have done that many times. I started off working with fiber in the early 90s, and we went from 10 megabits per second to over a terabit.
Well,
using a terabit using wave division multiplexing over the same fiber line in a period of 3 years.
Yeah, the fiber lines can easily, and this is why I'm a big proponent of the fact that I think we should stop when we should talk about fiber to the home as a utility. Like in my opinion, it would really make more of a difference for this country as far as being competitive in the world, is to just say we're going to, do what we've done with telephone, except with fiber, because that fiber, not 5G, not copper last mile, but fiber to the home means that we could escalate to 40 gigs a second without a lot of work, from the last mile situation. And that's what hopefully somebody thinks about at some point. Next question.
Okay, from Vienna, I guess that's a one-word name, in Australia. What sort of lighting setup do you recommend to properly and evenly light a person in an environment with harsh downlight, for example, in pubs and restaurants? I'm thinking open mic nights and birthday speeches.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So I'm not seeing anything with cameras there, so I'll start with just regular open mic type stuff. And that's usually on the PAR system. American DJ, Chauvet, they all make PAR. 64 and 38 are the 2 main ones. 64, of course, being brighter, and then 38 being less bright. And this was before LED system, so it doesn't mean there's 64 LEDs in there. As for doing any type of lighting, when I did an open mic, if I had a harsh light come on, I just walk over there and actually unscrew the bulb, or find a way to block the other light, and then put up my own lighting to help with that. Now, if you're putting in cameras, that's going to be a slightly different situation because you might have fluctuation of the lights, and I'll let somebody else explain that.
Go ahead, George.
So before pandemic, I started using the 300Ds from Aperture with some China balls. So if you have access to those particular lights, you have a couple of fixture options that can really help you in that situation, and you could get them for rental also.
Go ahead, Carl.
So from a photography standpoint, I would usually have just flash units on little light stands, and I'll be bouncing them all around the room to make it a broad light source, but they'd be set at like 1-to-1 power. So that'd be very powerful because I'm bouncing off walls, and I'll have my own flash on my camera, and I'll overpower any down light that's creating harsh shadows and dark sockets and all that kind of stuff. And I can actually shape the light as well, because depending on where I'm bouncing and at what power those flashes are and what they're bouncing into, I can control all that.
I will admit that in that environment, I really love big China ball style lights. We used to own, I think, 5 of the Air Stars that we would use. In fact, we did an event in Germany where we had, I think, 12 of them, and we just brought the entire ambient up of the room because we're going to have Q&A with the audience, that was there. And so being able to just have this kind of nice, soft feel, and it just feels really nice, like it. And now it doesn't give you it doesn't give you as much control. And a lot of times we will augment that with some other lights, but bringing up the entire ambient oftentimes just makes it look like you're at someone's house. Go ahead, Solak.
One of the things that you run into is the fight between distance and softness. If your lights have to be kind of further away, then you have to get a little bit more directional with your softness. And so I highly recommend looking at chimeras and a point source, because then you can get, and then with a honeycomb, because then you can get a light further away, have it be really soft, be comfortable for your people's eyes, and then look really, really good on camera, because softer light tends to look really good on camera.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question.
Okay, Douglas Carmichael asks, do you think Starlink will be the game changer for rural broadband in North America that its proponents say it will be? Or would terrestrial networks in rural areas create greater economic and social benefit?
Terrestrial networks would create a better experience. Go ahead, Carl.
So I'll speak from a rural area in Australia, which is similar to a rural area in America. So there's just not enough infrastructure out there to have someone run fiber out to a farmhouse if they're the only house within 100 kilometers.
So yes and no. Well, I don't know how Australia handles it, but we have a rural electrification and rural, communications that we did here, where we basically charged everybody just a little bit more, and then we just made it a thing that we will get the lines, and those lines, I will argue, were more expensive then, to put out into these houses than fiber is now. So the thing is, I would say that if we made it a priority to put that terrestrial, fiber to everyone's house, I will argue that it's much more beneficial for everyone in the rural area to have that kind of connection over. I think Starlink is going to fill in. I think that the thing that I worry about the most is that Starlink will dull the interest in, everyone will be like, oh, it's good enough. We have a bunch of people that write laws in our country that don't even use email. So they're going to be, oh, it's good. It's pretty fast, and we won't get it. We won't get anywhere. Go ahead, Rupert.
So just from a Starlink perspective, even though it's satellite and all that stuff, it's going to rely heavily on a whole network of ground stations. I was looking at the map for this the other day. Even in the US alone, there's probably near to 100 already. And so, it's going to depend on having those in those geographic locations as well.
And what I'm really excited about as a live streaming person, though, is the fact that I could go into the desert and get a great connection. That's going to be there are so many places that we don't explore, that we don't cover, that we don't do anything because, it's a sat truck, or it's this, and for a Zoom conversation, that may not make sense. But for a live stream out of Yellowstone, or a live, like I've done live streams out of Yellowstone, and that's a sat truck with a fiber relay and everything else, because that's the only way to get it out of there. And so being able to just point up and not have to do that is what it will be devastating for as sat trucks, I will say, because it's, for the day-to-day stuff, it's just going to be what you can use. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I was going to say, I've been doing some work with a couple of my clients in Canada, and they are really looking hard at Starlink, because it solves some of their problems for the northern part of Canada, where, we talk about the rural electrification service that was put in place during the Great Depression here in the US. Well, they never did an analogous thing in Canada.
Right.
And getting power and any sort of lines out to, places north of the Arctic Circle is a non-starter. They've all got local generators and stuff. So, I know for a fact, and they've been very public about this, the RCMP is already starting to prototype how they're going to use Starlink to replace right now they rely on geostationary satellites,
right? Which,
if you've ever been that far north, you realize that they are damn near pointing to the horizon to get to the
we haven't done it from the North Pole, but from the South Pole, the problem that we've had is that angle of incidence is so hard that the best we can get is like 1024 out of Antarctica, because it's just hard to propagate all the way to the geostationaries. Ken?
Yeah, my main hope that it is a game changer is that it forces the internet service providers into providing some real competition for them, and so that we do get a better service. That's my main hope that Starlink brings up, so people start signing up for it and thinking, then the ISPs have to really change.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, and the touchy situation is if you're looking at the more rural you get into more landowners, and so you have to may have to change some laws to gain utility access to private land in order to run those lines. But there's probably a law created that allows like pipelines to run across private property and so on.
Well, in general, there's poles already, like, because we already did it, so there's, it's pole access, is everything, and that's the, and for the main reason we don't have good internet in the United States in general is because of pole access. That's the only reason we don't have it. If we change the laws, it just said that, the incumbent has to give up pole access in 30 days or start paying $1 million a day, solve it. like per pole, it would just go away and we'd have a gig up and down within 5 years everywhere. It's literally that's all they need to do. And, but instead we're going to do some other things. Go ahead, Rupert.
Just in terms of terrestrial networks, just using the UK as an example, the used to be national telco, their BT or British Telecommunications, have set forth a plan to retire their copper network entirely, I think by 2025, something like that. So they will, if they're going to do that, will have to get fiber to everywhere that has copper right now.
Yeah. Next question.
Okay, coming in fairly early this morning from Rupert McRae in Dallas, Texas, says, what will be the best pipeline for receiving the Olympics in the U.S.? Broadcast cable, subscription, or streaming?
Streaming will be the highest resolution, most likely. The question really that we should do some research on is I believe that you will be able, there are some TVs that will stream 8K into the TV. There's literally no infrastructure for it other than streaming directly to the TV. The 8K, 8K high frame rate has been a priority for NHK for the last almost decade. And so they've been working on it for a long time. And we've been watching at NAB, we've been watching them show new examples. And all the 8K push has really been around the Olympics. And so now we'll see if they back off or where they go with it, but there'll be definitely some sports that I think you're going to be able to see. And we should probably do some research on what TVs. I think that pretty soon we're going to start to see an ad blitz for those of you who get ads. I don't get ads. I barely get any ads anymore. But for those of you who get ads, we should see an ad blitz, or we should see some push. We did see a huge push for 4K TVs at bargain basement prices. And that usually means they're trying to clear inventory. So we should see more of that. But I think that probably the streaming directly to the TVs is probably going to be one of the highest quality ways of seeing it. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So NBC is doing all the U.S. Olympic stuff, and I'm assuming you'll be able to stream it on their Peacock service. And they did mention that it was going to be 4K UHD for anything that's going to be streaming. And of course, they also have the delayed streams. So I don't know if the delayed streams will be more than 4K.
I just need a calendar. I seen a calendar thing that sets up just puts in your calendar when Simone Biles will be performing. Like when is she competing? Like when is she up? Because it's I think of all the Olympics, given the people that have now been eliminated because of rules, she's the one that I think everyone wants to see. So we'll see. Next question.
All right, Douglas Carmichael asked, what would be some best practices for integrating a digital audio workstation with a video editor on the Mac, Final Cut or Resolve?
Well, Resolve kind of has a lot of that built in. So I haven't had enough time with Fairlight to know how, it's pretty strong. We've done a lot of conversion stuff. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, you're right. So Fairlight is built in. It's one of the pages in Resolve. Whereas, unfortunately, we don't have a surround sound option yet in Logic or in Final Cut Pro. So there is Logic is there, of course. But yeah, that whole multi-channel thing hasn't just come in just yet for Final Cut Pro, I don't think.
Yeah. Next question.
All right, Douglas Carmichael asks, is there any benefit to running my studio at 48 kilohertz 24-bit versus 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit if I'm not creating audio content for video? It seems most standard resolution music content is delivered at 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit.
Go ahead, Carl.
So you kind of answered your own question there. So delivery, so consumption format is 4116, which is what Apple's moving to with high res and what CDs have been since the late 80s. For creation, you're going to adjust the sounds. You're going to change levels. You're going to change the sound itself when you're mixing the sounds. So you want the highest resolution you possibly can. For most applications, 48 at 24-bit. The 24-bit's kind of important. You want that bit depth so you can lower something, raise something. The levels aren't going to be perfect every time you record, so that's where the bit depth comes in. The resolution, depending on your setup in your system, depending on your DAW, that all depends on that. But you can go high resolution, but it depends if you're going to get anything out of it. But 48/24 is a good standard to have as a recording studio, and 44:116 is a good delivery format.
And for folks who are listening, there's all this 48 and 16 and 24-bit and 32-bit and all these other things, and the 44 or 48 is how often it is the analog signal is sampled, how often in time, and the depth is how deep, how many gradations of volume can be used to describe that. And it is higher. Someone asked me the other day, why is it so much higher with audio than video? Like, you can really hear it. Like if it's below 16-bit, you're going to hear it, jumping, it sounds, it really lowers the quality because audio needs more resolution to show it, and it's smaller too. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Mickey just added a comment, and Makana, a good point. If your audio is ever going to make it into video, you want to be at
48. Yeah. I would work in 48 all the time. And then if you decide to deliver in 44.1, you can. Next question.
From John Pewitt in Huntersville, North Carolina, says, when exporting from Screenflow, I have several options for export. I've been using ProRes 422. Is that the best option for Resolve?
I don't know if you would get anything more in 422 HQ. So the difference between 422 and 422 HQ, or one of the big differences, is 8-bit versus 10-bit. So you'll get more color resolution. I'm just not sure if that color resolution exists. The way that I would test that is in Screenflow, open up a gradient like the one behind me. Just do a circular gradient in Photoshop and capture that screen in Screenflow. Then export it as 422, and then also export it as 422 HQ, and look at where the stair stepping happens. So in a soft gradient, the stair stepping if you see a difference in that stair stepping, then it will make a difference. If you don't, then it won't. Go ahead, John.
So I'm not saying 422 HQ. I am saying lossless ProRes with alpha and ProRes 422.
So lossless ProRes with alpha is ProRes 4444. So that's it's a much larger format, but it's still, I don't know why they call it lossless. I guess they want to. It's not truly lossless. It may be, but it's pretty close. I mean, it's a really high quality
also have
product.
Web high, web low, and HEVC. If any of those make a difference.
Web high and web low are most likely H.264, and HEVC is H.265. So H.265 gives you the option of getting to 10-bit, as well as it allows you to, you'll get a compression improvement by 30 to 50%. It'll look as good as H.264 at a smaller number. Chris?
Alex, can you explain the gradient circle in Photoshop? Because even on my 4K displays, if I do that, I still see stair stepping within Photoshop.
Well, so change your Photoshop. Make sure your Photoshop is set to 16K, or 16-bit, not 16K, 16-bit. If it's in 16-bit and you do that, and you have most monitors shouldn't show much or any of a gradient at that point with a 16-bit gradient, and then you capture it. If you're an 8-bit, then you're getting back to exactly what we're talking about, which is that stair stepping, and that is just because there's not enough. With 8 bits, you have 256 levels of gray in RGB. And the problem you get into with that is that if you're covering more distance on an image than you have grays to describe it, you end up with a stair step because I don't have anything in between to describe that. And so when you add more steps by going to 10-bit, you now have 1024, or 12-bit, you have 4096. So as you add these up, you end up with a lot more steps, and so you end up with less banding because as you cover that distance, you have more steps to get from one to the next. But you start to see banding as soon as you have more pixels than depth. is how that banding occurs. Next question.
Okay, from Douglas Carmichael, he says, Keenan mentioned integrating Zoom into a wall for an emergency operations center. Considering that Zoom does not degrade gracefully over poor connections, case in point, office hours and Wi-Fi, wouldn't it not be an optimal choice for a disaster situation?
Go ahead, Rupert.
So it's important to remember that Zoom can be set up in a variety of configurations. You can have a private meeting connector and over a private network. A facility like that's going to obviously have some robust connectivity, so that'll be able to pipeline into that. Government agencies also have access to the government platform in Zoom, which is a whole separate infrastructure. And you also may see agencies or corporations talking about using Zoom, but that may not be necessarily that they're using it for their most critical functions. They may have some other platform for that and use Zoom for discretionary purposes.
And I will say that I have noticed recently that Zoom has more gracefully dropped to different lower resolutions than it has in the past. So 1080p for a long time, if you left 1080p off, it would go down pretty quickly and easily. And then if you had it 1080p, you'd see a lot of choppiness. What we're seeing now is a lot less of that in Zoom. So I think that some of the back end has also gotten better as far as how it's delivering that format. Next question.
It's kind of a follow-up. Keenan Campbell from Princeton, Illinois asks, Alex, you were gone when I asked this before. Best idea for video wall versus screens for emergency operations center. Many sources depending on disaster. Best hardware and software for a 46-inch video.
I think it's 46 feet.
Sorry, 46-foot video wall. Zoom will be integrated also.
Best, Keenan. You didn't say cost effective. So I'm gonna give you best, and then we'll talk about cost effective. The best would be I believe it's Barco makes a 0.9 millimeter video wall, which I've seen at about a little longer than 46 feet, and it's like looking at glass from about 10 feet away. I mean, it's at almost unreal. Just as much resolution as you need, and then use something like Disguise, which is a platform that it's what Tony Robbins uses now, I believe, is Disguise, which is they will let you map everything to those walls. That's probably the highest end solution that I know of as far as it's very expensive, but it would probably work pretty well. Go ahead, Courtney. Courtney doesn't agree with me.
Oh, that's not the highest end. I think Sony's Crystal Vision is the highest end. It has a very, very fine pitch, and I've walked up to, if you've seen the demos at NAB, it's like a 21-foot wall. You can walk right up to it and not see the pixels, and it's amazing resolution. And that 8K screen, which was, I think, 25 feet by 12 feet at the show, was amazing. But it's, up into $1 million.
Oh, no, the one. So there are some scaling issues with the Sony wall that some folks that I've worked with have had problems with. That's why it's a higher resolution. You're absolutely right. There's some scaling and stability issues that a couple people that I've known working on that. The one that I'm talking about at that size would probably be closer to 15 million. so it's like, it's a different, it's a different level of different scale, but I never want to tell people like, well, why didn't you tell me about the best one? So it's a pretty high resolution, and I think it was Barco, but I'm not sure, but it was brand new a couple of years ago, like, shiny new, like they were printing them for the client that I was working for. Chris.
Yeah, I would like to start a GoFundMe, and I will test this for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So when you go into the higher, so to back up after having the silliness that we just did, I think that you will. It just depends on whether how much you want to look at the edges. There's just going to be edges everywhere if you put monitors up, and so LED walls are pretty great. The good news is the LED walls have gotten a lot less expensive. I wouldn't go with an LED wall that is large, it has a pitch higher than 2. I think that you really, once you go over 2, you just start seeing lots of things that are not. The nice thing about the LED wall is that you have a big palette that you can just kind of throw things up. So if you get a system that can manage it, like Disguise, you will be able to, but it's a lot of hardware on the back end to drive it. So you just have to decide what's valuable there. Now, I think that something like Isadora would also be good on a more cost-effective solution. I don't know if Talak wants to give us 2 cents on that. Yeah. Oh, can't hear you, Talak.
You can take Isadora and output to multiple outputs and use LED screens, or you could use projectors. That's the other thing. Do an RP and really get do a lot of work, and then you can start to integrate things like Zoom OSC and really control what you're seeing out of Zoom in a way that is super useful, because you may not want to have everybody there. You might want to have some people there.
Yeah, go ahead, David. Did you have your hand up? Did I miss?
I just had one thing. Keenan mentioned a 200 to 300K budget on Ukana.
Oh, did he? Okay, 200 to 300K. Yeah, then definitely not LED walls. So, I mean, at 200 to 300K, I think that you would have a harder time, getting that to fit. I was trying to find, while we're talking, I was going to try to find you an example of.
I guess the question becomes whether or not for emergency response, what's more important, stability and always just going to work versus seeing the edges of things, or seeing, like, you have to kind of weigh that out and figure out what's the most important. And then of course, budget.
Yeah, I'm trying to find you the, I have a picture. Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to show it. Yeah, Keenan, we'll talk more. I'll see if I get someone to show you. I was at a stadium that has emergency response, and they have just an incredible amount of data. Like, they have every sale of like how many hot dogs they're selling in real time. Come on the wall. Like everything is going, like all the money, all the money, all the tickets, how many tickets are coming in, how many people are in the building at any point in time, down to a person, like as they go through the tills and everything else. And I couldn't remember whether they were using multiple monitors or not. Go ahead, Chris.
So on your example, the 42-foot wall that's running all this data, is this one application that's showing all the data, or is there multiple applications running across this wall?
So typically you have lots of different things feeding the data. And then what you're using is something like something like Disguise or Isadora or other things like that are taking many, many sources of data and giving you a palette to display that data on. So that's kind of a lot of the way that you kind of end up doing this, is to I'm just trying to find it. I can't find it right now. Anyway, so you have lots of different sources. You might have 10 or 15 or 20 computers that all have different pieces of data that they're managing. Now, some computers can push out 4 of them, because a lot of that data might even be full screen web pages. They're just web pages that are going out 1080p, out of an output, and one computer might push out 5 or 6 of them, that are all there. But you have to figure out what those data points are that you're managing, especially when you're just doing raw data and converting them. The web pages oftentimes work just as well as anything else. And then you have, but then you have to figure out, you push them all into a system, and in that system, then you map them to a much wider space. Go ahead, Talat.
Yeah, so I think that the important thing is to understand that you need is a media server of some sort, whether it be Isadora, watch out, all these different kinds of things. That is a media server that gives you the ability to put these squares of information inside of the larger window without any kind of menu bars or anything like that. It's just cleanly put together in a way that it will always work, and you'll always know where to look, because that's important in these types of things, where when people want information, they look at the same place every single time.
Yeah, and I will say that for for most video production, what we see is just lots and lots and lots of monitors. So when we're doing them, because we have a kind of a self-contained thing, we're not trying to display them out. It just is nice to be able to have, you can also think about a strip of LED that allows you, that you don't have to do the whole thing 46 feet wide as LED, but 46 feet wide as LED would be your whole budget. Like if that screen is all there, I mean, that'd be like 2.8 mil. You could probably get, you wouldn't be able to get, at high quality, you wouldn't be able to get 46 feet wide. I don't know how high, but we'll say 12 feet. Go ahead, Rupert.
So if you went down the monitors on computer route, I've seen up to 12 on one computer using a system called Monitors Anywhere. And in that case, those were dashboards. And the way I've seen that set up sometimes is that, okay, you'll have all these dashboards, but nothing will exist there that you can't also pull up on your computer. So maybe if you did have an outage, or you need to see something more clearly, you can get to it locally also.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so I've been looking at these really nice short throw projectors, that go out to 150 inches. Would you be able to mount, say, 3 of those along the bottom and then flip 3 over and mount them from the top and then have 250-foot stacked?
I will say that I think you'll find monitors to be troublesome. Like it's just, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Like for a theater experience, I think they're not. For an all day, every day on experience, I think the monitors would be, projectors would be difficult. Go ahead, Talak.
Yeah, so the projectors that you're talking about with the short throw lenses, there's other lenses as well called snorkel lenses, and that'll just widen out your shot a huge amount. You can do a whole cyc, 40-foot cyc. The problem is you're also making your pixels bigger by a long ways. And so when you do theater, just like Alex just said, when you do a theater thing where you're trying to put an experiential atmospheric look behind what's clear and crisp and live in front of you, it works. But if you're trying to look at it with a camera, that's a different story.
Well, and also if you're not even looking at a camera, if you're trying to read stuff on a monitor, if you're trying to read small text and it's being projected, a lot of times that becomes problematic. Courtney, last one, then we'll move on.
Yeah, one thing a projector would offer you is if you're in an emergency, room, emergency control room where you're looking at emergency information that must be displayed, a single point of failure is going to be your video processor to a video wall. And that could be catastrophic if you don't have individual displays duplicating all that stuff. And a projector, you could have a backup projector online and, turn it on instantaneously if you have a projector fail.
Sounds like this is a room that's in a building that just gets turned on when it's needed. So it's like not going somewhere. That's my guess. Next question.
Okay, from David Brady in New York. Can Ubiquiti Unifi switches be used without the Unifi console? I need more ports and plan to migrate to a full Unifi system, but want to do it in phases.
Go ahead, Rupert.
Yeah, a Unifi switch will work as a switch right out of the box, but just as a switch, you're not going to be able to get to any of the configuration or do anything with it. It doesn't have a local interface, but you can run the Unifi controller on a computer, either on Windows or Mac OS. So even if you don't want to buy a hardware appliance to do the controller later, you can do it in software right now.
Go ahead, George.
Definitely, I use them all the time on show site without putting it on the console.
Next question. Oh, can't hear you, Courtney. You went the other way.
Sorry, the click didn't work. Sometimes the click works and sometimes it doesn't. TJ Worrell from Minneapolis says, who is the Muse Group? Thoughts on why they've changed the Audacity Privacy Policy? They appear to be collecting a fair amount of information seemingly unrelated to audio engineering and software maintenance.
Or audio editing and software maintenance. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
So the Muse Group was formed right before the Audacity purchase, and Muse Group is bringing together a lot of different music tech. The name would have come from Muse Score, which is open source music notation software, but they're pulling in other things, guitar software and other music tech. So my guess, I haven't read the policy, my guess would be that they're going to be doing some marketing and trying to interconnect things that wouldn't be connected otherwise and would be outside of what Audacity does.
Yep, probably most likely. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, one of the apps that they have on there is called Ultimate Guitar, and I use that app a lot. And inside the Ultimate Guitar app, they have a kind of like a stories type thing where you can play a little bit of the song and then they go back and forth. So I'm guessing that's what that's for.
Next question.
Richard Lavery from Belfast, UK says, have been having trouble with Hyperdeck Studio. It will freeze if we let a clip play all the way out. When we try to move to another clip, the audio will play, but the image is frozen on what looks like the last clip.
What's the compression you're using?
It was on ProRes 422.
And do you know if the Hyperdeck Studio is all the way updated?
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, I noticed in the Blackmagic forums that it was saying things like, in 2016 that this was an occurrence, but nothing recently I could find.
Go ahead, Courtney.
I've seen this problem exist in other H.264 players. If you're depends on the format that you're playing, because H.64 is not a constant bit rate. A lot of times the length of the clip is basically a guess, and so some codecs don't gracefully handle, if they guessed the length wrong and the data runs out before it's supposed to, they don't handle that very well. So it could be a codec problem within the Hyperdeck itself.
What's saving it? What's saving out the file?
That might be one of the things that what Courtney mentioned, is that because we got the footage from a client, we had to transcode it into ProRes from many different kind of formats.
And what did you use?
We use Final Cut.
And
Final Cut and compressor.
Did you follow the frame rate, or did you force it?
No, we would have forced it into what we needed for the play out. So it was going from 1080 25, 1080 30 into 1080 50.
Huh. Because you needed to be at 1080 50?
Yeah. It was a games convention play out, so it was about 3 different days of 8 hour long shows. Every 45 minutes they would have a 15-minute break where we play out a clip that they gave us, and they give it to us in lots of different formats.
And did you force the number of channels of audio, or did you follow?
No, follow.
I would force that. The stereo.
Okay.
I think that it could be. That's what I would. The first thing I will do if a Hyperdeck is misbehaving is force all the settings. Like, don't have anything automatic. Like, just push them all through, and just drive all. First, get one to work. Like, export it out, get it to work, and then enforce all those settings across the board. I can almost guarantee it'll fix it. It's usually something with that. The frame rate or the channels and how they're being configured. But if you force them into stereo, even force them into mono just to see, but just try to reduce the variables until you get a working file, and then you can go up and then stop when it stops working. But I bet you it's something I bet you some of those have like some weird audio channels that are in there, or extra data that's in the audio channels. Because you can do a lot of things, especially with game capture, that's muxing things together. And it could be confusing the player, because the player's not. Hyperdeck is a great piece of hardware, but it's not a very smart piece of hardware. It doesn't go, oh yeah, this is a very complex format. I don't understand what it is. I'll play it anyway. No, it just goes, I can't do that. So yeah, so try those and see. I'd be curious to see if that works. Please let us know.
Yeah, we'll do.
Next question.
From Shrewsbury, UK, Simon Ray asks, Jeffrey and Chris were going to make a video showing how to set up a WLM meter based on Mickey's info. If this was completed, where can I find it?
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
In our heads, because we haven't done it.
Nice way to. That was a good way to form a ping into a question. Like, have you done it yet? Yeah. So it's good. We'll see if we get that sooner than later. Next question.
Keenan Campbell from Princeton, Illinois asks, what are the options for Egpu eGPU on M1? What's an Egpu? I have a current 2019 MacBook Pro with the Blackmagic Design Egpu. I'm hesitant to upgrade to M1 because the BMD eGPU works so well for single wire connection for my MacBook Pro and multiple devices.
Go ahead, Jim.
I don't think I have good news for you. I don't believe that's going to be supported. So no plans as far as I know. Of course, never say never.
Go ahead, George.
So I tried put my GPU into the M1, will not work. I think it's with the power of the M1s and what's to come, I don't think it's going to be really necessary to use an eGPU.
Yeah, I think the max number of monitors is 3, right? I think that's there's ways to hack it to 6, but max number of monitors. But it's the other thing to look at is how many do you need and what performance do you need, because the way that graphics is handled in the M1 is very different as well. Next question.
David Brady from New York asks, are there any third-party products that can display Zoom stats in a single window, a la Mickey meters? Would something like that be useful to the community?
I think that Jonas and Guy are working on a Zoom. I think it would be useful to the community, yes. So the meters, I think there's a lot of things that would be really cool, to put in. The meters, we've seen some scopes, we've seen, all kinds of little guides and things like that would definitely help. Go ahead, Rupert.
We're talking about the Zoom statistics that we would otherwise see in our own local clients. It's just important to remember that that is what you are sending and what you are receiving. So if it was going to be included in a gallery, it would either need to be the stats from somebody specific, or you'd have to remember it isn't meeting generalized.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, no, I find when I'm running meetings, I have access to the console, the web console for meetings, and I can punch through each person and see them. But it would be, I think, helpful to have an overall dashboard of those kinds of things. You know,
can you look at each person's performance over time in that dashboard?
Yes, you can. Yeah,
I've never done that.
In the post show, I'll show.
Okay. Yeah. It's really interesting. Next question.
Tlaloc Miguel Lopez Waterman asks, will it ever be possible to put the gallery view on the second screen in Zoom?
We can only hope. It's very annoying because it's what you, it's what I will agree with you that I don't fully understand the thought process of not allowing us to. There's got to be. I feel like there's got to be some reason for that. Like they never want you to lose the. They always want to make sure that you don't get lost and not have that. I guess I don't. Yeah, go ahead, David.
I think it's also because if you share screen, it takes over that first display, so you would still have eye contact with an audience or participants.
I think the question is, why don't we have the choice? Like we don't even have the choice to do it. Go ahead, Tlaloc.
Share screen actually takes over the second screen.
Oh. Yeah, it does. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, having the whatever, not only the gallery, but the host, all the controls, I would love to be able to move over to the, just that it's kind of all or nothing, being able to, there's like a lack of flexibility there that I feel like is either a horrible infrastructure design or there's some important reason they're doing it that they haven't told us, but it is very frustrating. Next question.
From Joseph Labond. What suggestions are there for a USB headset and software on Windows for recording audio-only meetings?
Go ahead, Rupert.
For a USB headset, I've had some pretty good performance recently out of the EPOS range. It's using Sennheiser technology. They're pretty good headsets, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Next question.
From Peter Rosato from Las Vegas, Nevada. Aaron Parecki was demoing the Hollyland Streamix M1 6-channel live stream switcher. Anyone in the panel read up on it or have any thoughts? It is pricier than an ATEM Extreme, but on the surface seems similar in function.
I think that the problem with any of these is that it's the similar in function. The problem is that you still don't fit into the whole ecosystem. So I think that that's always the the challenge. With all of those, I haven't even. I will admit I haven't seen it, so I'm as you talk through it. I guess this just came out. Oh, so it's a little touchscreen. So it comes with a little touchscreen. You can, it looks like a cool little, very very tiny little screen. Bet you it works just fine. I think that this. My guess is that this is very much like a, well, the interesting thing for for what they're doing is that they're actually they're working on sending tally back. So the ecosystem that Hollyland is kind of proposing is a wireless ecosystem. So the idea is that you have a switcher that easily integrates and talks to its transceiver. It just took me a second to kind of figure out what I was looking at, but it seamlessly works with the transceiver so that it can send tally back and forth, or it can, I believe that it can tally out. I think if it's not, then I don't know why you use it, but it seems like it's integrating with their wireless system more effectively. So I think it looks like that's what it's built for. I think the hard part for me when I look at those, if you're not using Blackmagic, the rest of the ecosystem, it could make sense. But it would, I'd be really interested to test it. It'd be interesting to see what Aaron said about it. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, it's saying it can do 6-channel video sources, SDI or HDMI.
What's the price?
Multiple platforms. Let me just check really quick. But basically PTZ control is another thing right there. Mm-hmm. And I'm clicking on buy now and it's not giving me any price.
Right. So
I don't know.
I mean, it could be, I think that's in the kind of the Roland land of it's got a specific use, and some people are going to go, oh, that's great. I can just pull it out of my backpack and use it. But yeah, I don't, it's the whole ecosystem that makes and the API that still makes it probably less competitive out of the gate, but for very specific verticals. And I'd love to see like what John Idelson thinks of it, because of the, the kind of the all-in-one thing. I think definitely has some advantages. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
$3,000.
Oh, 3,000. Yeah. I mean, we've done some stuff like I was talking, maybe it was in the pre-show or whatever. We were doing maybe it was earlier in this show, but we were talking about needing to connect in very odd places, and being able to be out in the field and not want to have a lot of wiring or setup or anything else. We actually had one where we had a person with an Apollo. This was the Atomos, I think, makes this Apollo that you could touch on 4 screens and cut. And we actually literally had it hanging down on one of our operators so that they could literally walk with a live view and have it wired in. All the cameras were coming in over wireless and they could just tap on it. That could actually in the field be a really interesting solution for that. Next question.
From George E. Kennedy Jr. in Washington, D.C. What are some of the best practices once you deploy a VPN over your network?
Go ahead, John.
So I'm going to give you 3 tips, at least that I find for increasing the security of your VPN, George. Number 1, deploy all security updates the second that you're able to test them and make sure they're stable. You're opening up your network to the internet, and anybody can get on if you have an unpatched system. We see this time and time again, and the least thing you want to do is get a cryptoware attack when you're doing a live stream and have all your systems encrypted in minutes. The second thing you want to do is you want to use 2-factor on all the accounts. Make sure that everybody has to either use something like a YubiKey or a token or a push notification on a secondary device to authenticate to you, the VPN. And then the last thing is deactivate accounts the second that somebody is no longer going to need them. If they've been terminated, if they're going on leave for a while and you don't want them to have access, you want to deactivate those accounts within minutes, if not to hours of doing it. A lot of the stuff we've seen lately have been accounts that have been left on with bad passwords. The Colonial Pipeline, for instance, was due to that. So you really want to be very careful with the security of it.
Good, George.
So I think one of the things about office hours, it allows us to be empowered. So I definitely took some steps last week to deploy the VPN. I have complete control of the ATEM Mini ISO, was able to also control mix effects. Well, launch it on my iPhone and control the switcher from outside. So I just wanted to get some more knowledge about, I understand giving different users access. So I definitely wanted to hear from the panel, giving folks, being able to give other folks control of that unit from outside.
Absolutely. Rupert?
Yeah, so I'd say if you're using VPN now to do something which you were earlier doing via port forwarding, remember to shut down all your open ports that you'd had set up before. Also, as soon as the VPN is set up, like the moment I've got it working, connected, I will test to make sure that everything that I want going over the VPN is going over it, and everything that I don't want going over it isn't. So, because you don't want to rack up bandwidth charges in the wrong place.
Absolutely. Next question.
Okay, from Douglas Carmichael. Will the prosumer ecosystem catch up and deliver 8K cameras and editing software at affordable prices or affordable price points as we see more adoption of 8K displays by consumers?
Go ahead, Carl.
At the moment, it's actually very hard to get 8K into those displays. As Alex said, they're streaming directly to those displays. That's one of the only ways you can do it, because HDMI 2.1 is not supported in any playback device outside of some labs and some very expensive broadcast test equipment.
Yeah, I think that I think that it's going to still take a little bit of time, and it just gets down to also physics. The little sensors have a hard time putting 8K of information in there. It's a 30, it's basically a 32 megapixel image. It's a lot of data. Go ahead, Courtney.
And if you're doing HDR, another thing to consider is what you're capturing onto. So it's going to take a pretty fast SSD. You won't be able to capture onto cards. So, you have to transition to that and think about the portability of whatever device a consumer or prosumer would be using.
It actually has been a capturing just into the Blackmagic. I was doing a bunch of 8K stuff, and you need an enormous amount of speed to capture it at a high quality. And you'll even see the limitations of that if you do 4K, records of like a whole bunch of trees with just your phone. You'll just see it just starts to turn into kind of like a little design down there because there's just not enough data to hold on to it. Go ahead, Peter.
I was going to say, I suspect that's why you see, because going from 4 to 6K was, my personal opinion, an odd breakpoint. You would have expected them to go from 4 to 8, but I bet you there's technical price point limitations that say that is about as far as they could go and stay within a reasonable price point for
now. Yeah,
for now.
Absolutely.
The speed of the hardware, what you were just talking about, the SSD and things like that.
Yeah.
I can buy a T5 and that's just fine for it, but it's not fine for 8K and above.
Yeah.
Right.
And for our producers watching, this will be a short show if you don't ask more questions, which is totally fine. Or we'll talk about something else. We'll come up with the second hour that we want to ask. But otherwise, go ahead and throw some more questions in there. Let's go to the next question.
Well, Douglas Carmichael has certainly stepped up to the bat, entering a lot of questions here.
When
great. You're integrating equipment with dual power supplies into a rack, is it best practice to connect both power supplies to separate power feeds? If separate power feeds aren't possible, should you connect both power supplies at all?
Go ahead, Peter.
Well, designing data centers for a living for a while, you use separate power feeds coming into the building, separate PDUs sitting along the walls of the data center, and then take each of the plugs coming out of the equipment and run them either from the rack, from dual power rails on the rack out to the different PDUs. Now, the other part of that question is it still worthwhile doing it? Yes, because it guards against power supply failure if the internal design of the machine is correctly done. There were some machines built in the early 2000s that claimed to have dual power supplies, most notably from HP. But if you actually looked inside of it, they weren't. They were dividing the machine in half.
Two plugs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
I've actually seen power cords walk themselves out of the power supply. So yes, plugging them in separately is a good thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Rupert.
Yeah, typically we'd see like power strips or PDUs down each side of the rack, like A, B. So that's kind of how that would go. If you have got two power supplies, two power sources and two power supplies, remember to monitor them both because you don't want one going down and never knowing about it. So remember to keep an eye on them both.
Tolak?
I think also depending on what part of the country you're in, oftentimes the power problems they'll have is actually internal to the house. You'll have a circuit that's overloaded, it'll pop. And so if you're gonna have a redundancy, absolutely split them across circuits so that you essentially are adding to your redundancy on a failure that will happen kind of often in a household or in a building.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Two things I would say. Also, make sure your PDUs are properly sized for your equipment that you have hooked up to it. I personally have done had to do the Apollo 13 trick where we had to go through and walk through all the hardware and then figure out in what order we could bring things up so we didn't overstress the PDU when we're bring the machine room back up. And the other story I will tell, and this was IBM up in the Northeast, we thought we had dual power feeds from the power company in New York State into Poughkeepsie plant. Turns out if you followed them with helicopters, they all ended up at the same
place
about 100 miles north of us. Yeah. We had a long talk with the power company over that one.
Yeah, exactly. Next question.
All right, from Douglas Carmichael. If you're using Zoom or something similar in an emergency situation where Mickey meters aren't available and there might not be time to coach people in using them, would an auto leveler or similar on each mic be a good idea?
If you're in an emergency situation, I don't know if you'd have access to the auto leveler. I think there is an auto leveler inside of leaving original sound off on Zoom is an auto leveler. Like it'll just try to get everybody to -20, I think is about what it's trying to shoot for. So I think that if you, if you don't have any way of controlling it, the best thing to do is just have everybody turn original audio off, and it'll do most of the work for you. Go ahead, Rupert.
I just think in an emergency situation, I'd make a point of having a person on the call, a coordinator whose job that was to watch out for those things, mute people, advise people, somebody to keep on top of that at a human kind of level.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question.
Okay, from Chris Fritchie from Tomball, Texas. When using Prime Cinema lens and you want to get a good focus starting point, do you measure to the front of the lens or where the lens meets the camera body?
Go ahead, Ken. Oh, can't hear you, Ken. I'm sure it was deep.
Yeah, it's neither of those. There's actually an indicator on your camera. On the Blackmagic 6K Pro, it's actually up here. It's called a film plane. Or in this case, it'll be the sensor plane. So you look for it's a circle with a long line through it. That's where the plane of the sensor is, and that's where you would want to measure from if you want to get a accurate focal distance.
Good, Courtney.
Yeah, he said it beautifully. It's the focal plane mark on the camera, and you measure from there.
And it's on just about every camera, so it's usually pretty easy to find there. Next question.
From Michael Vosbein in Woodstock, Georgia. Anyone see the musical performances on the PBS or CNN July 4th broadcast? Mostly pre-recorded video segments, but within those, the music was pre-recorded. Very hard to hear anything real these days, or to even know just what we're hearing. Comments? Bueller?
I think that we have to remember that most broadcasts aren't live or haven't been live for a long time. You don't really see much live in the real world. So we do a lot of live. We're doing live here. It's very unusual, and especially in uncontrolled environments. So news is very controlled. It's kind of, for the most part, news is disposable content. Like you're never going to watch the news again. Typically, I mean, unless there's, there'll be a clip of it you'll see over and over again. But for the most part, you're just filling in content. If you actually watch it, the vast majority of it is highly controlled and highly, in a little box that can be controlled and that they can cut away from. So when they go to a satellite truck, if that doesn't work, they're going to go to something else. and otherwise, they have, relatively good connections. What's really pushed broadcast into a corner is this idea of, we're going to bring something in from everywhere and it's all going to be live and we don't have very much control over it. And there's a whole bunch of, even what works here is because we do this all the time. We've kind of dialed all these things in to what we're doing. And so I think that's part of the advantage that we have there. So I think that it is they don't like doing it. Like when you watch the late night videos, those are 3 or 4 hours off shifted. And if you're on the West Coast, you see almost nothing live. Like we worked on Thanksgiving Live one year where we did a live stream that came right after Thanksgiving Live with Alton Brown and everyone. And literally when they shut the show down, they immediately called out all the edits, and some of that was already being worked on the EBS. And they just basically rebuilt parts of the show with all the ISOs for the West Coast broadcast. So the East Coast broadcast was the only one that was live. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I was going to make that point. The East Coast broadcast of Capital Fourth is usually always done live. Whether the performers are doing lip sync or whether they're singing, they do have a live orchestra there. COVID has changed that somewhat this year. They had much more pre-recorded roll-ins than they usually do. Usually they'll have a live performer there, but because of travel restrictions and so on during the pandemic, a lot of performers couldn't travel, and it depends on the comfort of the performer whether they want to do a live nationwide broadcast. Some of them get cold feet and want to work to a track or work to a pre-recorded, but almost always that Capital Fourth is a live broadcast origination in normal non-COVID times.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of it has to do with crew density. The crew densities are much lower, and so the producers are, because of the COVID, and so the producers don't want to take as many chances because they just don't have as many people to fix things, and they're just like, well, let's bunt. So let's just get a runner on first, So I think that's a lot of that, and I think it's valid. And we see that in a lot of places. Next question.
Okay, from Jim Hankins in Chesterfield, Michigan. Alex Lindsay mentioned he has used the X32 rack. Are you using a MADI interface card to integrate with the ATEM constellation in the studio?
No, I don't. We rarely use on the audio in the constellation. so that's kind of the what we put into our mixers is typically Dante, our entire networks on Dante. And then we may use the constellation as an embedder. So we send everything in, and that might be the final embed before it goes out, but we're not using it in any significant way. And I have to say that I haven't barely used the ATEM software, the software. It's not fully formed in my opinion. I mean, it'll get you through here and there if you need it, but I feel like there's still a long way to go. I just don't feel like Blackmagic totally understands audio, and so I think that it's getting better each time, but especially in the hardware, we have, the MADI, I believe the MADI is still like 64 in or 32 in or something and 2 out. You're just kind of like, okay, I don't understand that. Like, I don't understand why we don't just have a real MADI interface. And so those kinds of things have led us to not do that. So we embed it somewhere else. Usually it can be embedded into the Hyperdeck. Through the Hyperdeck, it can be embedded through a Terrenex AV, through another recorder, through, we also embed them via the, ironically with MADI, via the FSHDRs that we use. So there's a bunch of different places that we can put the audio in. It just depends on our pipeline. Next question.
From out in Silver Spring, Maryland, Brian Anderson asked, Bird Dog recently released a new box camera, the PF120, with NDI, HDMI, and USB webcam capabilities, 20x optical zoom, and 1 to 2.86 inch sensor. Any thoughts on this camera and use cases? And he puts a link in there.
Go ahead, George.
So I watched the launch of this camera. It's definitely pretty attractive with a f5.2 to 104 millimeter lens. So it's going to get you pretty wide, and also starts at f1 on the aperture. So it's going to take you down to what you're looking at me right now. So I think for certain instances it's going to be great, but again, it's part of the Bird Dog ecosystem. So you're kind of locked into that ecosystem.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, the ecosystem thing is exactly the point I was going to make. I mean, I have as my main camera, depending on whether I've been shooting during the day or not. I'm either using my older Sony AX100 or my Blackmagic Pro 6K, but my PTZ cameras are both Bird Dogs. And I mean, the reality is I could swap out the AX100 for this new Bird Dog box unit, have arguably a newer system, and they're not Blackmagic controls, but all the cameras would be on the same control system at that point, doing all the color matching, back to the conversation we've had. And so that would be easier. But I mean, I can't think of a good reason to do it other than it's a super expensive webcam, and I've already got one of those.
Good.
Actually, I got 2 of those.
Right.
Yeah, the main use cases, like if you've got a multi-camera setup, you can mount that and have that set, because with all the other Bird Dogs, obviously it can move around, so you know that that's pointing in that direction and that won't change because you've mounted it and fixed there. So you can always go back to that shot.
It seems
because
it
hasn't moved.
Yeah, it seems to be a competitor with the little 4K box camera that you can get from Blackmagic in terms of what its use cases would be.
I think that I will admit
Leo
that
might like it.
I will admit that I'm a bit of a sensor snob, so I just really like short depth of field. I like the feel I just like the way that a larger sensor feels. So I don't really pay a lot of attention to these cameras until their sensor gets to 1 inch. So 1 inch, 4/3, Super 35 are the 3 that I will go to 2/3, a 2/3 inch chip at over 75 feet, because focus becomes hard. With a large sensor, once you get over 75 feet, it's hard to track focus, on it, except when you're at a sporting event where they have, but even then you'll see the challenges in that. the end zone cameras. They were using, I think, A7Ss for the end zone cameras for the NFL in the last couple games in the playoffs or whatever. And you could just watch that poor person trying to hang on to focus, but they were opening way up, but they were just trying to hang on and they just couldn't quite keep everybody in focus. It looked great though, Brian.
Well, and that's sort of my question. It seemed like an odd mix of that small, relatively small sensor. A USB on it seemed a little odd for $12.95. I wasn't sure if the value proposition was.
I mean, it's sense. A PTZ at $12.95. A PTZ is good, and
it's not a PTZ.
Oh, it's not a PTZ,
right?
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Peter.
I mean, I use, and I know, Brian, you used a bird dog setup too for your wife, right? And I mean, I have two of the PTZs in here. No, there's the other one. It's not pointed right now, but there it is. But it looks like it's just that camera repackaged without the PTZ part, and they lowered the price point just a bit. Not a lot, but just a bit. And I have used the USB out, believe it or not, Brian, just to hook it up to another machine. I mean, all three of those interfaces are active at the same time, which is kind of fascinating. I mean, the SDI, the HDMI, and the USB are all active at the exact same time. So I could take it into three different systems and see what's going on.
Next question.
Andre Dole, forgive me if I murdered your last name there, from Berlin. What platform product would the panel suggest for one-way chat communication for a hybrid event? Chat shall be embedded in the customer's website so people can ask questions and only the host or the team will see and manage them.
There's a couple different platforms. Go ahead, George. Were you about
to? Lately, I've been using Vimeo because Slido took away the chat function. It's only Q&A now, but before it was Slido. But
Slido took away the chat function?
I still can't believe to this day they took it away. I don't know why. It was just kind of silly.
It's really good.
But Vimeo is probably your best bet as far as having something integrated.
Sorry, I'm just confused. So the funny thing is I'm confused that Slido would do that. The reason that I find that to be confusing is that we started with Q&A 12 years ago. It's just Q&A, the predecessor to Makana. We very quickly learned that you had to have a chat function in there. Like, it didn't have to be crazy. Like, I know that there's some discussion right now about whether we should improve the chat function. We probably will. It's just a budget thing and other things. And I'm going to add, my next thing that I want to add to this, to Makana, is threaded comments against the questions. So not necessarily threaded discussions, which I think will actually become pretty crazy if we put them in the chat. But when someone asks a question, being able to start threading discussion against the question, and comments and suggestions and other things that we can add to it. So, but when you take the comments out, the problem is they'll put their comments into the question system. Like, that's what happens. It just jacks up your whole, like, it's like taking, then you're no better than YouTube. Or I don't even know how that would operate. Like, chat is the pressure valve for all the Q&A. Like, that's the most crazy thing I've ever heard. Anyway, so we provided in Makana, and you can contact me in Discord. We're just an expensive solution right now because everything's hand coded. So if you want the boutique, hand built version of it, we do that as a service. But Slido, I was gonna suggest Slido until George said that they took out the chat function, and so I don't know. You could, if you just want questions, Slido will work. It'll do the questions up to, I think, 10,000, which seems like a large number, but not necessarily. But anyway, but I think that would be the one that I don't know. I mean, you could probably build a web page that did this. I mean, you call Ken will do it for you. He can put it in a web page, then have it just done. Like, that function of just taking questions and not doing voting and not doing chat and not doing all those other things. That's something I think there's probably a plugin in WordPress that will do most of that, right, Ken? I mean, there's like, you just get a good web designer like Ken, and he'll put it together for you, and then just call him. Anyway, go ahead, Ken. What are you saying?
Yeah, I was saying I was about to build one for Tony's website, but then you did offer Makana, so I thought, thanks. I'll save my time.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rupert.
Can we just recognize Ken for wearing cufflinks?
Is he wearing cufflinks? Well done. Well done. There you go. I used to think when I first started wearing cufflinks, so it was probably in high school, I thought that you had to loop them around and not have them put together. And I got really good at it. And then people who wore cufflinks looked at it like, how do you do that? And it was really hard, to not have them sandwich, anyway, sorry. I can go to a long conversation about cufflinks. Anyway, next question.
From Roberto Barro from Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania. Is there a way to set a 6-mic drum mix in an XR18 and then bring that mixed signal into our X32 through a single channel?
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so you can. It'll be mono when it comes into the X32, of course, because it's coming through a single channel. But yeah, so you'd send all 6 from the XR18 to auxiliary 1, let's say. And then auxiliary 1 is just simply an XLR out of the XR18 into the X32, into any channel you want. And then you have all 6 of those mics going in.
Next question.
From Tlaluk Miguel Lopez Waterman, the man with too many names. What is the reason that the USB output of the ATEM line crushes the blacks?
Go ahead, Carl.
I've done a little test on this. We talked about this last week as well. So I put my camera HDMI directly into a monitor, and then I put the ATEM directly into a computer, and then that's directly to the monitor. Going through QuickTime. QuickTime is the most flat I've noticed. It doesn't play around the signal too much like Zoom does. It was pretty much even Stevens.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on what application, what software you're going into. Zoom, we know that crushes blacks, but maybe a lot of other software does that. But I've noticed QuickTime on a Mac doesn't.
Yeah, I know. That's what I've noticed too. But QuickTime on the Mac looks exactly the same as my monitor output. Go ahead, Talon.
Oh, so I see. So it's actually Zoom, not USB. I got you.
So what Zoom is going to try to do is in the same way. I mean, we almost need to have a button just like we have original audio, we have original video. Like, I don't do anything to my video. I think that's what's missing there is that Zoom is trying to make you look more punchy, just to make it look more visceral. And so it just pushes the whites, it clips the whites and crushes the blacks, and it tries to increase the saturation a little bit. So that's what we see is that all those things change. And that's a Zoom. I'm sure that it's there to make you just look more peppy. So, and make everyone look better, they think. But when we have a lot of control, then, and we are actually looking at it, it's more problematic for us. So go ahead, Courtney.
And there is a setting in your video settings to improve my appearance, which is a checkbox you can check, and that will further change its enhancement of the video in what it thinks improves your appearance. With me, there's no hope.
It just blurs it out. It's like adding Gaussian blur.
Yeah, it's touch up my appearance, I think, is oftentimes it's a ProMist filter. I think what it does is it blurs your layer and then does a soft light transform over top of it, or a very subtle add on top of it, which just kind of fills in some of the black areas, some of the just like creases and stuff like that. Next question.
Also from Tlaluk Miguel Lopez Waterman. On the large Tony Robbins style shows, how many people is too many people?
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
It depends if they're just a background or if he's addressing them. If he's trying to actively address them, then I think once you go above like 49, 50, then that's where you're getting maybe too many. If it's just a background for aesthetics, then 2,000, 4,000.
I think that there's a question of what is in front of him versus what's behind him as well. And go ahead, George.
Jeff Kitley says there's never too many. He said 25 to 3,000 on a wall is a good number.
Yeah. So I think that the thing is it's how well can you manage them is the question. It's not how many that you put up. I think that on a 180 degrees in front of again, I'm going to probably get a chance to look at the whole 360 idea. I'm not because I'm really worried about the quality of the background. I don't think that, and I've never been that successful with projecting in the background. I'm not that excited about people being behind the speaker, but in front of them, I think you could put, 2,000 in front of them and they just see a big crowd. Then the question is how quickly can I select a person like you, like I would if I was in let's say I'm in something with 1,500 or 2,000 people. I could point out to somebody and say, you stand up and let me give you a mic, and being able to virtually get to that person, be able to know who they are and be able to engage them in the conversation. It's the tool that is the limitation of how many you put. Now, how many people are in it? it can be the, you know, for that kind of thing, you could have 50,000, 100,000, 150,000, doesn't matter. What matters is that then you have to, as you get a larger group, you have to figure out, how am I going to choose the new people? How do people feel included? How do they, now the thing that Tony Robbins does is that fixes some of those is all the breakout rooms. So that's what Jeff works on, and a lot of, and works on with Blue and everyone, and Grant, is they blow out into little atomized rooms. So people still have that personalized experience. And then still are part of a large crowd. And that's something that you, when you really think about it, I mean, I've worked in seminars and conferences for about 30 years, a little over 30 years. And that organization of putting people into small groups and then large groups, is much better virtually than it is physically. Physically, it's like, if talk, you know, share with your neighbor, that's easy, right? You just turn over and start talking to them and go through whatever role playing you want to do or whatever. But when you say, I want to have groups of 5, and you want to do it any other way than people sitting right next to you, it becomes this disaster. You know, like everyone has to stand up and they have to go. Now, if you want to give them sometimes we use that in seminars to give people time to walk around. so there's the little gap. But those are the things you have to kind of think about. But I think it can get very, very big. Go ahead, Rupert.
So if you're talking about really big numbers like that, is there any distinction between whether those are truly live feeds or whether they're just thumbnails of some sort?
I think that so when it's working, I think that the live feeds make a big difference. And I think that you can do that. I don't think you have to have all of them. I mean, if you have 150,000, I don't think that it matters to the speaker to see 150,000 people. I think knowing there's 150,000 and seeing 1,500 of them, you know, even just seeing this panel, like I could not do this show without this panel, because like there was something I was saying and Courtney was like shaking his head. And so I threw it to Courtney, or I saw that he doesn't agree with what I'm saying, or David was, so that was, I think I was starting something and then David started nodding his head and I was like, okay, I'm on the right path. You know, like, you know, so anyway, so the thing is that I'm looking at people and looking at their response. So as a speaker, I do think it's important. Speakers always say, well, I need someone in the room. So because you need to feel where things are going. Having live returns from 2,000 or 200 people gives you some sample of all of those people out there, if it's an accurate sample. So you're getting a feel for the audience and where they are in what you're doing. So I do think that is pretty powerful. But I think that, but then it doesn't have to, it can be representative. It doesn't have to be everyone. Because, you know, when you're in a stadium, I mean, I've stood up on stage, you know, at a stadium when there's people and when it's full before a show, I'm just setting up something. It's kind of stunning. Like I can understand why they say, oh, I can't do it without that. It's like this 70,000 people in front of you is a lot of people, but after the first couple, you don't really pay attention. It's just a lot of people. You don't see a person after that. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, part of my own expression and nodding and stuff is why I don't play poker.
No, what's funny is it's intrinsic to what we do. Like the nodding, the shaking the head, the looking away, all those things are important feedback. That's the whole, I mean, that if everyone just stood there not moving, it would actually be less useful. Yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
And I was going to say, Rupert touched on this. If there's not direct interactivity involved, where the host of the program is interacting with the people on the wall, you know, you can aesthetically arrange it so that the people aren't big enough. The little squares are not big enough to be distracting in the background, but they're big enough to let you see some movement and a little bit of reaction. And you can also tile. I've seen a lot of shows that don't have 30,000 channels into their meeting, duplicate tiles so that there actually will be repeats, so that they have software that rearranges them randomly so that you don't see that they're notice the repeats as much, and it just fills it out aesthetically to make it look like many more people are attending than are.
But as far as the maximum, I think that we're going to see digital first events that go into the millions in the next 2 years. Like it's going to be just massive events that are including people, and it doesn't necessarily again mean that they'll. You have to think about in this kind of thing, a plenary versus a breakout. So that you can have a plenary where all 2 million are there for part of the conversation, and then it breaks out into smaller things where they break out, or they go do something, or they might go out and take action on something and then come back and be in the larger plenary. So there's a lot of things that can be done, and again, those kinds of meetings would be impossible in the real world. And when we get to the point where those digital meetings are getting to a point, they're doing things that you can't do in the real world, is when, you know, they will become the main way that you do this. It's probably, you know, in the next 3 to 5 years. You know, we'll see a lot of it happening. We're already seeing touches of it now, but when it fully matures, the big game is going to be online, and then the personal game will be in person, and the hybrid thing will be just kind of something in between that doesn't really last for very long. Next question.
Another one from Tlaloc Miguel Lopez Waterman. Is there anything about HDR that could feel not natural, or is it more natural?
Go ahead, Ken.
HDR is actually more natural. If you think of our eyes, you know, I've got a big soft light in front of me here, and the background there is in dark, but I can see both. You know, our eyes are really doing that. Well, it becomes kind of unnatural, and I know this because I do this with my photographs, is HDR's everything is super saturated. That's really when it becomes unnatural, when the HDR is actually just adding saturation to everything.
Yeah, Carl?
So the HDR output is usually mastered by someone who's mastering. So they usually have a mastering monitor, which is usually 1,000 nits. So generally with mastering, if you think of like the black, gray, and white panel that we see for the video check charts, the black will be set around 5 to 7% on that particular chart. But if we're thinking about nits, so it'll probably sit around 20 to 30 nits, that black panel, and the white will sit around 300 nits. Now, white for a chart would be about 90%. That's generally what it is, and black will usually be around 5% on those charts. So 90% to 100%, which is overexposed or, you know, completely clipped for the camera, that's what you're left with the last 700 nits. And that's how we see. We don't see in a linear format with our eyes. We see in a log format, and that's what they're actually doing there. They're taking that last 10% of what's on the sensor and stretching it from 300 nits to 1,000 nits. And that curve is what the mastering engineer will do, mainly for colors. So if you've got a sunset, a bright colored sunset, you want that curve to be correct to make sure the sunset colors look correct and there's no banding or solarization as well.
Go ahead, Chen.
Ken touched briefly on photography. One of my side hustles is real estate. If you go to realtor.com and look at 10 listings, you're going to see some bad HDR. Around all the edges, you'll see haloing because they push it too hard.
Because that's not really HDR. Where they call it HDR, what that is tone mapping. So it's remapping the there. So you do get into, like with anything else that we do, people taking something cool and trying to take it too far, take it farther than what it should go into. You know, that you see that in surround music where people are putting things everywhere. You see it in lots of things when people have a new tool, like all the transition tools that you see in video editing apps and even on our switchers, the star transitions and all these other things. Anybody who uses them, is, or lens, what we used to make fun of was lens flares. Lens flares for a long time before J.J. Abrams. Lens flares were I don't really know what I'm doing. Let's put a lens flare across here. Let's add some production value by doing, which I did myself when I first got started. And then you learn not to do it anymore. And so I think that with HDR, people get excited about those things and they overuse them. And I think that's when they don't look natural, but they can definitely look very natural when it works. Next question.
From Henry Ramos in Yonkers. Opinions on a Sony A6600 for gimbal video. Don't have the budget for the A7S Mark III.
Anyone have any opinions of that either way? Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
So the 6600 is not bad. It has S-Log 3. So you'll get a lot of the features you would find in the bigger cameras. If this is a camera you have, or if this is a camera you can afford, it's not a bad camera for a gimbal if you do records. As far as live, a bit tricky on a gimbal. But as far as records, this is a pretty good camera to go with and a large lens. It's APS-C, so essentially you only get better depth of field, but that may be better if you're on a gimbal because you may not be able to focus as easy either.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't have the 6600s, but I have several of the 6400s, and they've treated me well. Don't overheat, clean HDMI, great autofocus, and, they're a bargain with, some of the Sigma lenses. So
that's great. Next question.
From Douglas Carmichael. Has there been any thought of indexing the /YT IoT times data produced by Mukana to create a searchable index of office hours questions and answers. I could even see Zoom's transcription feature being very useful in this regard.
Definitely a lot of thoughts in that area. So it's a one programmer. so there's a long list of things for Chris to work on, and that hasn't gotten to the top of the list yet. But we know that over the next year you'll see some indexing that goes on. I think that it's missing every day. We give up a lot of data by not doing that, and it's just a matter of us figuring that bit out. Go ahead, Rupert.
So those timestamps are in the YouTube video description currently. So I believe you can do a YouTube channel search, and if you're searching for a keyword, it'll come up that way.
It'll find it there, yeah. So yeah, we're definitely looking at some pretty we have potentially a project that's going to let us put a lot of resources into that kind of thing coming up in the fall and spring. So you probably see a bunch of additions. Next question.
From Tlaloc Miguel Lopez Waterman, how important is lens considerations for video is high leaf count in your iris?
Go ahead, Carl.
So what's more important is odd number leaf count. So 9 and 11 are what you're going to find in most cinema lenses. It's the odd number that will give you the nice starry lens flares as we're talking about. But yeah, so even numbers you'll sometimes see in cheaper video equipment, but or sometimes you just see 3. So essentially it's just a triangle that closes in some really cheap handy cams. But yeah, so you'll see on most cinema lenses, well, photography lenses is usually around 9, cinema lenses are 11. So that's kind of the trend you'll see for between photography and cinema lenses. You do see some with 8. They won't look as nice in the out of focus areas in the bokeh, and they won't have as nice specular highlights in those bokehs as well with the lens flares or lens stars you get.
Good, Ken.
Yeah, lens consideration was the reason I chose my Ursa, because I could put my Nikon glass on it, because I love my Nikon glass, so I wasn't going to give that up for. That's why I chose that camera. So for me, the lenses are the
Ursa has
a key thing.
A Nikon, Nikon,
yeah.
in American, a Nikon.
Nikon.
It has a mount for that.
Yep.
Oh, very good. It does. Nice. Next question.
From Jim Sutty in Glasgow. I'm using a data video PTC 140 in a house of worship setup. What are the panel's views on using optical plus digital zoom? I use only optical zoom at present.
Yeah, I never use digital zoom unless I absolutely have to. Unless there's there's almost no good reason to do that. I mean, there may be, it just gets soft and oftentimes aliased, especially when a camera does it. It tends not to have a great solution. At best, it's going to get softer. At worst, it will get aliased as well. So go ahead, Courtney.
I think it does depend on the resolution of the sensor. If you have a high enough resolution sensor and you're outputting 1080p, so you've got the room, it's doing compression to begin with, so the digital zoom is just throwing away some of that compression. You can get away with it. But like Alex says, better to avoid it and do the optical zoom.
Yeah, this is not it's a 1/2/8 inch 1080p sensor. I'd be hesitant to use that to digital zoom that. I think you're on the right path of what you're doing right now. Next question.
From Douglas Carmichael. According to this document, he puts a link in, Zoom saves transcriptions as VTT text files to the cloud. Could an office hours index combine captions with the time data?
It definitely could. Again, we're not there yet, but it definitely could. VTT is a fairly simple file format. So it's the VTT and SRT and lots of other things are very close to each other. Slight formatting changes in between them, but the VTT generally has what you'll see is a time code and what text goes in there, and it's really designed to for the captions to be loaded in. So it's a simple format to grep. To go through and pull things out of, but it's not something we just have done yet. But you absolutely could connect all of those things together, and people have connected them in different ways over the last decade. But we haven't tied all those things in yet. Next question.
From Georgie Kennedy Jr. from Washington, D.C. What are the difficulties of hybrids and overcoming video latency from venue to player?
Yeah, go ahead, George.
So maybe another time I'll be able to talk a little bit more offline about it. But we talk about this a lot on office hours, and I got to see it firsthand. I mean, I've done my own hybrids, but this was DC to another venue, and then to player. I definitely saw a lot of latency, and I'm trying to figure out, where do you sacrifice? Because obviously you want your player to be in sync, but where, Alex, I don't know if you could speak about that a little bit. Well, because again, it was a big event, but I can't really talk about it because obviously you want to keep on being called back to those gigs.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing that you, especially when you start going venue to venue, if you are bouncing from one venue, if you put those in series, you really have to think about latency. If you put them in, if they're connecting to all the venues together, you'll have a little bit of latency there. But one of the things to do, and the question is does it matter? Like, does the player matter? Does it matter if it's 5 seconds behind or whatever, in that process? But the lowest latency that we've experienced so far has been the switch. So the switch, if you connect those venues with the switch, you're going to get down to 50 milliseconds between them. And at that point, you could go in series to 2 or 3 different venues, and you'd still get back at the same speed as one connection with Zoom. So if you're using, the problem is that the switch is probably 3 times lower latency, 3 or 4 times lower latency than LTN. So LTN is going to be a higher latency, less stability. The switch is just a lot more expensive, but the way that you cut that off is to do that. Now, if you have some kind of dedicated MPLS or something else, you can use a Nimbra and tie things together that way. And it's kind of what the switch is doing in that case. But you get, more redundancy through the switch. Yeah, go ahead. And this is not a switch. This is the switch, which is a video transport system, a global video transport system that's used by broadcast and networks. Go ahead, Peter.
I'm just trying to maybe add some clarity, just because I'm coming at it from the data center perspective. Not sure why you'd ever want to connect them linearly and not use a star topology, so that you're bringing all the venues into a central point and to your point, switching them there, as opposed to go from venue to venue to venue to venue.
Yeah, well, and we've definitely, generally the way we've approached it is to do exactly what you're saying, which is that we switch the venues to we switch the venues to each other in one central location. So for a long time, our DC facility was that.
We call that a star topology inside the data center.
Yeah, so we would always go out. The main thing that gets tricky with that topology, depending on how you do it. Now, I don't think the series necessarily helps, but in the star topology with video, you have video and audio. You have to do mix minus in video as well as audio. So if you're sending a full program back to everybody, you need to think about video mix minus as well as audio mix minus, so they don't see themselves coming back. And that can be done with a router. That can be done with separate. What we've done oftentimes with that is a separate switcher. That's literally, and we didn't get to this point, but we started designing, we did it manually, where someone would be following the switch and cutting what that venue got. But where we were going with it is tying all the APIs together inside of the ATEMs, so that you could sit there and, like, for instance, now you could do it with the number of outputs that you have. You could connect a whole bunch of them in a constellation and just be constantly sending, you could set up a behavior that when you cut to a location, it never sends itself. It sends the last edit back through out of an aux. Go ahead, George.
So my final thoughts on it was, I understand now why we speak here a lot about digital first. The only reason for that event being at a venue is because the clients wanted to be on that stage. So that was it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, that'll last for a little while. I mean, people really, they have, people like what's comfortable and what they know. And so, but it's our job as event producers to produce something that is compelling enough that eventually they'll go to one and they'll realize that. And the best thing to do is to have the executives actually watch the event, like remotely. Like when they're there, they're on stage and they go, "Oh, this is great. And I'm really glad we could figure out this hybrid thing." If they actually watch the hybrid on the other end, on the stream end, they're like, "Oh, this is horrible." And that's what we got over years and years and years of getting paid a lot of money to try to figure it out. It's just not a great experience for the person who's actually watching. It makes everybody feel better that they're live streaming it and that they're including this huge audience, but they don't realize that audience is just not very engaged and not, you know, and not compelled, you know, because they're not being really included. And so that's the, you know, that's the challenge. And even in the areas that we hold as like examples of hybrids that work, like sports, when we start adding interactivity to sports, we've done tests in this area, it becomes super intense. And then people have a hard time going back. So that's the feedback we got with some of the stuff we did with sports, where once some people got used to the idea that they could be part of it, when they couldn't be part of it, they just disengaged. You know, so that's the danger of doing it, is once you add, it's like, you know, just dripping, you know, adrenaline into the system. You know, and so once that adrenaline goes down, people won't want to do it anymore. So that's a real challenge in a lot of these interactive events. Next question.
From TJ Worrell in Minneapolis. When I interface my Blackmagic Design Pocket Cinema 6K cameras with ATEM Pro ISOs, I lose the ability to record ProRes on camera. T5 is his destination device on the camera, I assume. Blackmagic Design RAW and other formats are still available to record on camera. Is this a feature or an operator error?
Go ahead, Carl.
So my guess is, like many panelists here, you've set up your camera to look good as a webcam, which means you're using the full aperture of the camera. So that's going to be 6K. 6K is only available on RAW. There is a scaled down, so a scaled down version of UHD, so which you'll have to do. It'll only work at 30 frames a second, not 60. So if you choose that option, the reason is when you're plugging into the ATEM Mini takes over camera control and it's going to your 6K setting, because that's probably what you set it to look good without the black bars top and bottom. The problem is that because you're doing that using the full sensor size, it's only RAW. Blackmagic RAW can only record 6K. So as far as ProRes, that's going to start at 4K or UHD. So you'll have to pick one, probably UHD at full sensor at 30 frames a second. You set that in the camera settings inside the ATEM. You can, if you can, if not, change it to the camera, but save the ATEM so it remembers that. That way you can record in the camera at 4K ProRes, and it will pump down out of the camera whatever you choose, of course, because there's a different out for the output, and that'll probably be just 1080, 30 frames a second.
I have to test it. I have to admit, I just record RAW all the time, so I just don't have a lot of Apple ProRes. I mean, we've done a couple of those things, but we've never. I know that we do outputs, but I think most of the time when we've done those dual outputs, we've done it with the Ursa. So I'm also not sure whether that's a chip limitation that the 6Ks have. So yeah, we'll have to dig into that a little bit. Next question.
From Stan Chan in Roseville. If you're building an 8K streaming platform, what would the workflow look like? What is missing from the current ecosystem that is needed?
Cameras. Like, it's kind of funny that we have 8K hyperdecks and 8K constellations and no cameras. I think cameras would be a good place to start. I think there's just like a handful of them that do it. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so outside of Sony's cameras that will be using the 8K cameras they're using for the Olympics, and Astro Design, another Japanese company, they have an 8K workflow. The other problem is like an Elemental. That's probably the harder part at the moment. I'm thinking if you could try to do 8K at even 30 frames a second down streaming.
Yeah, you're probably looking at $100,000 encoder right now. I mean, the Elemental 8, I think it's the 800 will do, I believe, 8K. And so I think it's 412G inputs. I don't have one, so I'm not sure. So anyway, but I think the 800, the Elemental 800 will do it. And but I think that those are like $100,000 a copy, to do the encode. So, getting the 8K encoding is a thing, that we need to think through. And then all the stuff right now, because a lot of our stuff is all on 12G, and 8K is 48G. So your incredible 40 input. I mean, that's why the Constellation has 40 inputs. Is it's not really 40 inputs. It's 10. It's 10 8K inputs. The Constellation has 10 8K inputs, and it has 6 8K outputs. So it's a very basic switcher at a very high resolution when you use it that way. So, and I will be surprised if we do not see an 8K camera from Blackmagic at NAB. Like, I don't have any inside information, but I feel like they can't wait forever. And they've proven that they've now have a camera that does 8K with the 12K camera. So I think that they have the sensor, They have, you know, a lot of the things figured out. I'd be very, very surprised if we don't see an 8K camera there. But those would be the basic things. And then you have other new problems, which is, well, how are you going to play the graphics? You know, how are you going to, you know, so there's, you know, so what graphics output is going to be 8K out? And so, there will be other sets of limitations. I do think that things like sports will be the first thing that you do it with, because it doesn't need as much of many of the other things that we have. But you do have playback already with the Hyperdeck. You could theoretically do a lot of that, you know, there. So you could put together a pretty good show at 8K right now. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I'm just going to go back to the comment we made earlier. Your point about Blackmagic, you wouldn't be surprised if it came out with an 8K camera soon. It's all about the price point of the components and whether or not they can get the components to make them right.
Yeah, right now there's, we've talked to a lot of manufacturers that are literally delaying their release schedules because they just don't have the chips to do it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Next question.
From Craig McFarland in Boston. When does the flicker from LED lighting in consumers and household products, I assume, impact video streaming? Currently using a Logitech Brio. Will Pro Video lighting make a difference?
Go ahead, Carl.
Pro Video lighting will, but even with Pro Video lighting, when you're not at 100%, essentially just adding a square wave to the light, and that can interrupt with the frequency. So if you're at a 60 hertz and you're running, let's say 75 hertz, that's we'll definitely see some flickering. So you got to be careful of that. Generally with household lighting, run it at full wattage. So if you have a dimmer, if you're able to dim LED lights, don't do it. Even with pro lighting, don't dim it. It's better to diffuse it than dim it electronically. So yeah, because the square wave is usually perfect at 100%, and just control the light the old-fashioned way with diffusion and scrims.
Go ahead, Ken.
I know this might not be relevant in your case, because I think you're US based, but I know with the Brios here, I had a clients and they had the flickering lights in the background because it was set to 60 hertz. As soon as they switched it to 50 hertz, the flickering stopped. So that might be
and you see the flickering if the shutter speed is faster than your voltage is the problem. So that's the big problem we get into overseas is if you're at 60, that means the shutter is going faster. It's opening and closing faster than the lights are going. So if you can match that either at 50 or less, it could be 25. It'll now not do the flickering that you had there, even if it doesn't match, or even 30, it won't flicker. It's just that the shutter speed can't be faster than the voltage speed. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, exactly what Alex said. But one thing to consider in a lot of these smaller electronic cameras that don't have actual variable leaf shutters, they vary their exposure time based on sample rate, or basically shutter angle in the old world speak. So even though you have it set to 25 frames and you have 50 hertz video, it could be sampling at a different rate. So you're going to end up with temporal artifacts if you have any type of on-off in your lighting in the background.
And sometimes in your Brio, you can turn the gain down, and then that'll force the shutter speed to go down as well. Or you can pull both of those down. So there's ways to kind of go down, and it'll look nicer too. Go ahead, Rupert, and then Talak.
As well as the flickering and all those challenges, with the consumer light bulbs, is just going to have a color accuracy mismatch also. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's less likely in the Pro line.
Yep, Talak.
Well, and there's Pro and there's Pro. So some units will actually have flicker control settings inside of their settings, and so that what you're doing there is playing with harmonics, and that's the problem. That's the problem you're running into across 50 hertz versus 60 hertz and things like that. That goes along the spectrum of all the frequencies. It's using pulse width modulation in order to dim the unit. And so if you find yourself using the dimming function on your light and you're seeing flickering, change the dimming a little bit and see if you can get out of that harmonic range and have it not flicker inside of your particular camera. But also look in the settings. If you do end up getting a more expensive Pro light, look in your settings and you'll find the ability to fine tune that kind of problem.
Next question.
From Ash Yadav from New York City. For hybrid events, what's the best way to get the audio split in a room PA, and what's going out to Zoom with multicam and mic setup?
So the main thing that you have to be careful of is returns. The echo cancellation or some version of that is the thing that you have the most trouble with. That's what I'm assuming you're talking about with the audio split to the room PA. Is that when someone's talking, you don't want that to return through the mic back to them and vice versa. So the big thing is the person on the far end. If you can get them to wear an IFB, it's a lot easier without open speakers. Two venues talking to each other via speakers and open mics can be complicated. And so it can be done. What the other side of that is the easiest mic to use for this is an SM58 because it has a lot of high off-axis rejection. So you hold that, as long as people hold it up, the SM58 is just, we always tell people tap your chin with it and then pull out an inch, just tap it and move out and you hold it there. If they follow those instructions, there's not a lot that's going to happen in those speakers. It's going to be problematic. If they're going to wear labs, now we will use oftentimes, I believe it's a WL184, which is like a big old capsule lav, or the DPA, and I can't think of the name right now. I can't think of the number. But there's a DPA that is a very directional hypercardioid, and so you can wear those. Those will pick up the speakers if you're not careful, so they're not going to be as good as the SM58. And so what you end up doing is what we employ is a Dugan auto mix against those two speakers. So when the person's speaking on stage, it's pushing down the speakers, and when the speakers are coming up, it's pushing down the mic. And it lets us, with enough tuning, it works pretty well. You can use gates and other things, and you can also do attenuation based on multiple tracks. Those are all different other ways to press that down, but we found that the Dugan Auto Mix works really well when used by an expert like Brian. so when we hand it off to somebody else, it turns into kind of a rolling 737. So anyway, it's you just have to be very, very careful with it. Usually when people haven't done it before, we tell them to just use an SM58. Next question.
From Douglas Carmichael. I filed a bug report with Blackmagic Design support regarding a bug in Resolve video catching up after using a menu in the Mac OS, and have not heard back from them since June 14th. Without owning a paid version, is there a way to escalate my case?
I still haven't figured out the bug. Like I think that I know that this has been something that you've brought up before, Douglas, and I'm not. I think it actually is doing what they designed it to do. So I think that's the issue, is that they probably, I don't know if you can escalate it, because I don't think that they're going to look at it as a bug, because I wouldn't look at it as a bug. Go ahead, Ken.
No, you just said it's not a bug. It's their feature is if you're going to look at the menu, then the video stops because you're not focusing. I think Chris Fenwick talked about that. So it's not a bug.
Yeah. Next question.
From Brody Hefner in New York City. For Zoom video playout, is the recommended approach always to push 1080p and rely on Zoom to adjust frame rate and resolution to account for system limitations? Or are there situations in which it would be preferable to push 720p?
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
This is something we could actually test out. So if someone who was co-host wants to just push out some video now, we can see.
I think we might not try to do it today, but let's maybe it almost seems like we do a second hour, or at least when we know it's coming, to think about what we. I think it'll take a little time to set up, and we're already over time. But we'll think about it. In general, I would always put out 1080, and not go down to 720. I think is what I would do there. Go ahead, Courtney.
I would say it depends on what the content of the video is. If you're going to try to push out a demonstration or something where they have to read fine text and fine menus, then you've got to go with the 1080p, and a lower frame rate will be fine. If you're doing a talking head or something, 720p will probably work fine, and that way you're more likely to be able to serve everybody out there in the audience's resolution, depending upon their connectivity, with at least a high-def image.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael says, for working professionally in the non-music audio world, would Pro Tools knowledge be necessary for most positions? I've worked with Logic, Ableton, and Persona Studio One, but it seems Pro Tools is still the market leader.
Good, Carl.
So Pro Tools had a big install in the early 2000s, and studio owners generally aren't music producers or musicians, so they'll stick with what they know, and they'll talk to their friends, and their friends are still on Pro Tools. So it's hard to move these larger studios out of that system. So you'll notice that maybe you may need to know Pro Tools to go into those studios, but a lot of home or project studios are using whatever that producer wants because the cost has now come down on DAWs.
Next question.
Looks like our last question for the day, huh? From Douglas Carmichael, for someone with multiple skill sets, I'm equally passionate about it, IT, audio, production, planning, etc. How should I deal with finding a specific area to focus on while still not being too narrow in my planning?
Go ahead, Ken.
Well, until I can get my cloning machine to work, I think if you stay off social media, watch less TV and have time in the day, it's difficult. And I have the same issue. I love doing all different types of things, and it's a hard one.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I've had this problem in my career. Now that I'm retired, I don't have this problem at all. But yeah, if you find whoever pays you the most for the least amount of time, go with that.
You know, I generally have a pretty good long-term sense of where I want to go, and so you know, I've talked about it in the past that I kind of think about it as tank tracks. That I usually have some portion of what I do that I'm trying to get rid of, some portion that's paying all the bills, and some portion of that's taking me where I want to go. You know, and that taking me where I want to go is usually not making much money. At some point, that one in front of me becomes the thing that is generating all my revenue. And usually that's a gradation, you know, it doesn't. And when I'm doing it, usually I'm not making any money doing it. I'm not trying to. So I have something that's paying, like when I was learning how to do graphics to go all the way back, I was DJing weddings. DJing weddings was something that was paying all the bills. When graphics started paying all the bills, then I got rid of DJing. so it was, you know, and then in graphics, I was doing print graphics, and then I moved to broadcast graphics, then I moved to game graphics, then I moved to legal graphics, then the film graphics. And in each one of those cases, the one that I had learned was the one that was paying all my bills. The one that I was trying to get into wasn't paying any bills. And I was putting tons of work into that new thing to figure it out. And, you know, and so what I would do is I put my 40, 50 hours a week into the thing that pays the bills, and then I'd put another 30 or 40 hours into the thing that doesn't pay the bills yet, and I just keep dumping into it until it generates revenue. And sometimes it didn't, and I did something else, but very rarely. Generally, it started generating more revenue than the last one, and I just kept on going, and that's all I've been doing for 30 years. Go ahead, Rupert.
I would just say that if you are going to focus in an area for a time, just remember that is all experience. And if you refocus later, that's all experience, and that's something you'll bring with you into whatever that area is.
Yeah. But I always look at the thing that will stop you also. I mean, there is take the one that pays the most amount of money. But you can get caught up. Like there's lots of things that I didn't do that would have benefited me because I just kept on taking the next paying job. And, you know, I needed to figure out a way to keep on generating revenue, but sometimes it helps to say no to things that, you know, will pay well, but will not allow you to move forward. Like when I took a job at Lucasfilm, I took my pay cut to go to Lucasfilm was over $200,000 a year. To go from what I was making weekly to working at Lucasfilm was a $200,000 a year drop in where I went to work on Star Wars, and it was worth every penny. like you know, in the short term, it was insane, and probably the end of a marriage. Anyway, but in the long term, it solved it. It solved a lot of things. You know, it gave me incredible amounts of freedom into the future. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, and if you're passionate about something, you'll quickly find out. It'll filter up to the top eventually. And I think you'll find that if you find yourself devoting more time to the job than you're being paid for, in other words, you're working off the books basically to make yourself better at whatever you become passionate about or involved with, I think you'll find that that's going to bubble to the top, and you'll eventually be able to be paid better for it because you'll be better at it than almost anybody else because you're devoting more time to it.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Well, I was going to variation on your track theory is I always worked on the two list theory. There was the list of things my boss wanted me to do, and there are things I wanted to spend some time on learning about that might turn into the first list over time. But you know, it was me trying to learn new things, and you know that was, you know, in my early years at IBM, that was using different techniques for chip design and things like that, because I was doing certain types of circuits, but I wanted to learn. I started off in power engineering.
Right.
But I wanted to go over and learn about logic circuits. And so things like that. Just participating in this is my second list right now, because I'm, well, it is. I mean, I'm serious, because I'm just about ready to hit the retirement road. And this is something I'm enjoying learning about, and eventually will want to maybe participate more actively.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that my goal with what we're doing here is to build this kind of big playground that eventually we're doing lots of projects. I mean, doing Office Hours 2.0 will be part of that, of letting a lot of people play and just figure out what they're good at, what they like, and learn from each other. But eventually that could be a lot of different things happening all at one time. We don't want to put too many out at one time to make sure that we don't stretch our community too thin. But the goal is to have just lots and lots of places for people to play and figure stuff out where you're not getting, you may not be getting paid for it, but you get to work with a bunch of other people and learn from them, in a safe environment. Because when you start getting paid, it also has to happen. So when you're not getting paid, you're like, oh, we're doing the best we can. When you are getting paid, it's a different level of accountability. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Another great conversation. Remember, tomorrow, thinking about the audio filters that you like to use. So the plugins and audio filters and so on and so forth that you like to use. We'll have a little roundtable discussion for the second hour. And now we're going to jump into the post show. Thanks for all the great questions for the producers. Thanks for all the great answers and discussion from the panelists. And we'll see you tomorrow, or see you in a